we will get all of our fun features going for the evening, and I'll share my screen so that we get to enjoy my fun slideshow demo as we begin our presentation on strawberries tonight, or not strawberries, tomatoes. Dave, I hear someone unmuted and didn't want the audio to get picked up. So I'm going to put you on mute just since we're recording. But we have our tomatoes presentation this evening, and then next week will be our last presentation for our spring series, which will be on herbs with Heather Adams. And for our Zoom viewing this evening, in the upper right-hand corner, if you at any point see it in gallery view, as they call it, with all of our other participants and only want to see the speaker, you can click the view button and then click speaker only, as you can see here in the upper right hand corner. Like I've said in past weeks, if you've participated with us in other workshops, I will also be controlling what speaker is, as Zoom calls it, spotlit or spotlighted. We haven't decided what is the past tense of that as we go, but just so you all are aware of that. At the end of the presentation, we will be having our question and answer session with our presenter, Dave Long, and also our live planting demonstration presenter, Sue Tonzi. So we will have our questions put into our chat box. So at the bottom of our screen on Zoom, we have lots of different options, including one box that has a dialog box and says chat. When you click on that, it will open up a white box, much like this one, where you can type a question to myself and Graham. I am with the UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center, and I will filter all of those questions for our Q&A session. And then, as you may be seeing some subtitles on the bottom of your screen, Zoom is sharing this new great feature to help us make our workshops more accessible. Anyone in Zoom can actually access these, so we're not too special, but we're excited to have access to this and to either turn those subtitles on or off, or to view a full actual panel of the live transcription. On that bottom row, again, you in the live transcript area, if you click and hover over it, this up arrow will appear, and you can either have the option to hide or show subtitles or view the full transcript. And if you view full transcript, you'll see a box much like this one, where you can actually read and follow along as to what our presenters are saying and talking about. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Dave. He was our strawberry extraordinaire last week, and he is going to talk us through our tomatoes presentation this evening. Super knowledgeable gardener and has years and years of experience trying to grow in the Tahoe region. So we're very excited to have Dave back presenting, and I will remove my spotlight and turn it over to Dave whenever you're ready.
Okay, well. Okay. I'm wearing my garden hat, because if you're going to be growing tomatoes in your garden, you're going to be in a lot of sun. So make sure you have some good protection. So let's talk about potatoes. So let's see what's going to go. No, tomatoes. Thank you. And here we go, I hope. Let's see. We're talking about growing food in Tahoe. We're talking about tomatoes this year. Our workshops are brought to us by a whole group of organizations. Slow Foods Lake Tahoe has been instrumental in handling the logistics for this, as has UC Davis and Tahoe Environmental Research Center, which loans us Ann Graham every week to help us get through this. Master Gardeners of Lake Tahoe has been instrumental in providing many of our speakers, including next week. Heather is a master gardener. I'm with the Tahoe Heritage Foundation, which has a small garden over in the Pope Estates in South Lake Tahoe. A lot of this plant material has been grown for us by the Desert Farming Initiative at UNR in Reno at their greenhouses. So let's talk about tomatoes. Oh, before we do that, okay, so there are 4 demonstration gardens that you can go and visit to see how some of these vegetables go. The Truckee demonstration garden includes best management practices displays, as well as landscaping, plants, and vegetables. The North Lake Tahoe demonstration garden is at the Sierra Nevada College. The Truckee demonstration garden is at the regional park, and it has a demonstration garden for vegetables, as well as now a new community garden that you can rent space. Our Tahoe City demonstration garden is at the Turk, or the Tahoe Environmental Research Center field station. And then again, my location is at the Talac Estates, the Pope House. So growing vegetables, tomatoes. This is really Tahoe's problem child. When you start seeing the plants in the nurseries down in the valley, we're still struggling with snow. When you're trying to grow tomatoes here in Tahoe, you're fighting the critters wanting to taste even the slightest little red of your tomatoes. And then when your crop really looks like it's coming together very nicely, we typically have our early snow or freezing weather, especially in the Truckee area, that occurs the first or second week in September. So growing tomatoes in Tahoe Truckee is really a challenge, and we're going to talk about how to overcome those challenges. The topics today that we're covering is a project overview, which is what we're doing now. We're going to talk about garden practices and phenology, some taxonomy, planting and care of your tomatoes, some history, which I always like talking about. And we're going to give you some specifics about the varieties that we're offering this year. And then this coming Saturday, we will be distributing the plants as we have every week at our locations. And that will be at the end of the presentation to make sure everybody knows where they're going. Okay, when we're talking about gardening here in Tahoe and Truckee, we want to be aware of what we're doing. The location of your garden should be away from streams or the lake or percolation basins, so that we do not contaminate, pollute, add nutrients to the watershed. The garden should be located not on a steep slope or where the runoff cannot be controlled. We want to make sure that excessive watering does not push nutrients below the root zone where they're not available, but once below the root zone may contribute to impacting water resources. Nitrogen fertilizers especially can be health issues. In the Carson Valley area, that's extremely important. Okay, here we want to be conscientious about our effects on the watershed. Nutrients and chemicals should be applied at the appropriate concentrations. Any excess fertilizers or pesticides can make their way into streams, lakes, which can cause a blooming of algae, an increase in the amount of algae that you find in the streams and lakes. We want to be mindful of the amounts of fertilizer that we add. And even if you use a low ratio fertilizer, it can have a big impact if you tend to over fertilize. And most important, if it looks like it's going to be rain or snow or sleet, fertilizing at that time is not recommended. It contributes to runoff or moving fertilizers away from your garden. When you do apply fertilizers, it's best to do it while the soil is moist, so it speeds the uptake. Pretty straightforward. I know we've talked about this on each and every presentation, but we do believe this is an important aspect of gardening in the Lake Tahoe Truckee area and the Carson Valley for that matter. Okay, phenology. Phenology is the science that looks at what weather and climate due to plant varieties. And for us, we're looking at varietal comparative phenology. So we're looking at the differences between weather and climate as it affects different varieties, in this case, tomatoes. Pretty straightforward. So what we're looking for is which tomatoes grow best here in Tahoe, Truckee, and the Carson Valley. Okay, so why are we doing tomatoes here in Tahoe, Truckee, and the surrounding areas? Well, you could make an argument that it is the most commonly grown vegetable in the U.S. By home gardeners. And for sure, it is the most widely canned or bottled commercially vegetable in the world. And it is really a challenge to grow tomatoes in the Tahoe Truckee area. Tomatoes gained legal status in commerce, anyway, as a vegetable in 1893 in a Supreme Court case, Nix versus Hayden. So even though botanically it is a fruit, commercially and in terms of gardeners, it's considered a vegetable. And another interesting fact is that the first commercially available genetically modified food licensed for human consumption was a tomato. It was Cow Gene's Flavor Saver tomato, and it was sold between 1994 and 1997. The advantages for the Flavor Saver was that it would not soften when it riped. It could be shipped long distances in hot weather without it breaking down. It had a tremendous shelf life. The downside was that they introduced a gene from E. coli, the one that makes everybody sick. And so that kind of negated any advantages in terms of public acceptance of this. And it was discontinued in 1997. Some fun facts: California leads the nation in total tomato production. We're neck and neck with Florida in fresh tomato production, but we are far, far behind China, who is the world's leader in tomato production, followed by, surprisingly, India, which is number 2, and US number 3, bronze medal for us. Egypt, Tunisia, and Turkey eat the most on a per capita basis. And not surprisingly, Italy exports more tomatoes, that processed tomatoes, that's canned, bottled, whatever, than any other country in the world. More interesting facts: eating tomatoes was featured on an episode of You Were There on both radio and television. We'll talk about that later because it involves Thomas Jefferson. The longest tomato vine was 65 feet in length. The largest tomato, over 7.5 pounds. The most tomatoes on a single plant, 342 pounds. And kind of an oddball thing here, Heinz Ketchup, or Heinz Company, introduced colored ketchups, purple, green, and blue, in 2000. 3 years later, they were all discontinued. I mean, who would want to have blue or green ketchup? And my favorite is The Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, was voted one of the 10 worst films ever. Surprisingly, there was a sequel to that movie. Okay, the Roman Pliny the Elder, a naturalist, first described the genus Solanum. He was talking about belladonna and eggplants. The meanings were either it meant that it needed a lot of sun, which tomatoes do, or a soothing effect. And Linnaeus gave this species name Lycopersicum, which actually means wolf peach, because at the time that he named the plant, it was thought to be poisonous, and either the tomato forms that were known in Europe at the time were fuzzy, many tomatoes are, or the hairs of the plant looked like wolf hairs, and so wolf peach. The funny thing about that is that even though it was called wolf peach in Germany and many of the Central European countries, in England it was called the love apple because there was thought to be some aphrodisiac component to it. Yes, I had to throw that in. Okay, tomatoes are in the Solanaceae family, which includes potatoes, nightshades, and the eggplant.
Yay!
Yeah, the tomato plant is native to South America, the foothills of the Andes. It was not grown as a food very much in that area. It's not found in Central America until you get into the Mexican region, where the Aztecs used it extensively in their culinary preparations or endeavors. The plant, so that's kind of an interesting aspect, because the historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists are interested in how it made its way from South America to northern Central America and Mexico, and it was not used as a food extensively in between that, which indicates a trade. Well, enough of that. The plant itself is pretty straightforward. There's a root system that's a typical root system. There is a stem, the compound leaves, flowers, and then the fruit. The flowers typically are in groups of 2 to 12, and each flower needs to be pollinated. You can hand pollinate, which is what they do in greenhouse situations where you have greenhouse tomatoes, they hand pollinate. So you do need pollinators. One of the interesting aspects of the tomato plant itself is if you remove the leaves and plant it deeper, where those leaves were and the hairs on the stem will become roots. It's kind of an interesting thing that our demonstration person, Sue, will talk about in detail. You can define tomatoes by either color, or by the growth habit, or by the size. So the colors range from pink to green. The plant types are either determinate, which are bush type, indeterminate, which are more your heirloom, or those that are in between the semi-determinate. And then the tomato sizes, which is kind of what we selected this year, are from very small ones, currant, all the way up to the big beefsteak, which are used for slicers on sandwiches, or ox heart, which is an unusually shaped one, a tomato that, anyway, unusually shaped ox heart. Determinate varieties usually have compact stature. They're called bush tomatoes. Most of your commercial varieties of tomatoes are bush type or determinate types. The reason for this is that the fruit ripens all at the same time and then the plant dies. So from a commercial standpoint, you can bring your equipment and crews in, harvest it in a short period of time, and then they can move to the next field. Whereas the indeterminate varieties or heirloom types produce a few fruit over a very long period of time. And these are the vine type of tomatoes that you see. In southern climates, obviously not Tahoe, Truckee, or the Carson Valley, they can overwinter, or they will resprout from the base of the plant. So our first example that we're handing out is not actually a tomato. We're offering this year a Tomatillo. It was recommended by Sue Tansey, who grows them, and so we thought we'd try it. It's an indeterminate plant, very closely related to tomatoes. It's sometimes called a ground cherry or husk tomato. It has a paper husk over the fruit itself, which is how the name came about. It's a small 1-inch fruit, yellow, has a pineapple flavor. It's typically eaten as a snack or placed in salads, although in large volumes it can be canned and made into a jelly. And this is a very common variety in Mexico. The next one we have is called Matt's Wild Cherry Tomato. It's also an indeterminate heirloom tomato. We're very excited to try this out. It was found originally in Hidalgo, Mexico, brought to the state of Maine by agricultural workers, and then commercially introduced by the University of Maine, Matt Liebman, who gave his name to the fruit. This particular tomato has been described as anything from a currant sized tomato, very, very small, to a cherry sized tomato. So we're very interested in finding out from our growers, you guys, whether or not we're going to get cherry size or smaller. It has a very good flavor and very sweet, and it is resistant to a number of the soil plant diseases. So we're very excited to try this one out. Glacier tomatoes are either classified as determinate or semi-determinate, like they don't quite know what they're doing. This one was introduced in 1985. It's from Sweden. It is a cherry-sized tomato. Fruit is 1 to 2 ounces in weight. It produces fruit over a much longer period of time than a true determinate tomato. As a consequence, it may be classified as a semi-determinate. It sets fruit when the temperature drops below 50 degrees, which is very cool for a tomato. And again, introduced from Sweden. So we're very hopeful that this will be a high producer. It is resistant to, it is not resistant to fruit splitting. Fruit splitting is a common occurrence in tomatoes and is caused typically by inconsistent watering. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. The next one is Rose de Bern. This is an indeterminate heirloom variety, about the size of a large apple. It's the color of a red apple. This is a great producer of very sweet type tomatoes and is often used as a slicer on sandwiches. And again, it was developed either in Switzerland or France, depending on who you talk to. Rose de Bern. For this one, we're interested in this to see the size of the tomato that is produced. The pictures and the descriptions always show a very large tomato, which will be very unusual for Tahoe. But the Rose de Bern is also a very cool weather tomato. So we're interested to see what's happening. The last one we have is we only have a few of these tomatoes, and this is the Arctic Rose Dwarf tomato. It is a determinate variety. It's specifically developed for people doing container gardening. It was developed by the Dwarf Tomato Project. I'm not sure if this is part of the Snow White Project or what, but it's supposed to be a very good producer in cool or cold weather. It was released in 2012, although not well distributed. So we're very, very interested to see how this does in Tahoe. The flesh is pink in color. And so we only have a few of these varieties. Each location will have some. And we're specifically looking for people to grow this in containers, which is how it was why it was developed. Okay, planting tomatoes is kind of a couple different ways of doing it. And luckily we have Sue Tansey down in the Carson Valley who's going to show us a couple examples. So Sue, take it away.
Unmute. Okay, I've unmuted.
We can hear you and you're good to go.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Sue. And this is going to be the first demonstration here. This is called deep planting. So I've dug it ahead of time to save some time here. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your container and you're going to measure twice the
We did a demo of this yesterday. And
as the container, twice the height. So you dig your hole and that's good. But does everybody see how it should be? My dirt's going to be there when I'm done. So you want to go really deep. It's a good way to have really good root structure. This guy's really strong. You want to pop it out of the container, roll it. I like to roll it like this. Don't be too hard on it, but you don't have to baby it. Just do this till it comes loose. Tease it out a bit. Okay. And now what you're going to do is you're going to remove all the leaves from the top of the dirt. You're going to find all the first set of flowers, which I see a little tiny tomato right there. So I'm going to take off all the way to here. So just take them on off with your finger. It's okay. Okay. And then you're going to place it in the hole. And backfill. I will make this pretty later, but this is just for demonstration purposes. Like about right there, you don't want any leaves touching the ground at all, because that'll just invite disease and pests, and this will keep it nice and healthy. You can pinch the flower off if you want. I'm going to. Actually, that one's pretty sharp. Okay, so that's deep planting, and make sure it's in there nice and good. Yeah. Okay, and the next one is the trench planting, and as you can see, this is a little bit leggy, and I want to bury it. I want to bury it deep, but I don't want to dig that deep. And another benefit to trench planting is right at the surface, so you can take more water and nutrients quicker. So I've dug a trench here, right here. About 4 to 6 inches deep. Pop it out. Again, remove all the leaves and everything that's going to be under the dirt. So I'm going to remove everything to about here. You're going to lay it in the trench. And that's a good spot. Just want to bend it just a little bit. Try not to snap it. There you go. And then at this point is when you want to stake or trellis your tomato plants. For indeterminate, you want to use a trellis. Any kind of stick will do. Just do that, and then you get your strings like that. Or you use a tomato cage. And put it in now, because if you don't, you'll ruin all the roots of the growing tomato plant. So get it in there as deep as you can. It's not cooperating. Yeah. But you get the idea. Get it down to like right here if you can. Right by the baby, so it stays off the ground, and that's trench planting.
Fertilizer.
Oh, shoot. Don't forget your fertilizer. I had it right here. This is a granular fertilizer. It'll do a slow release all year long. And I'm going to I'm gonna side dress it since I forgot to put it in first. So I just want to dig down a little bit, put it around. Then it'll get there. All right. Now you're all set to grow some beautiful tomatoes. Take it away, Dave.
Hey, thanks a lot, Sue. Let's go back and talk a little bit about our tomatoes. So let me see where we're at here. Here we go. We talked about the Arctic rows, so let's move on. Planting. One of the things that Sue demonstrated was the lateral positioning of the plant near the surface. The advantage for Tahoe Truckee, of course, is that it provides warmer soil at the top near the root zone. The downside of that type of planting application is that you have to be very consistent with your watering. Otherwise, the water level will affect your fruit development. The deep planting one is great because you can manage the watering a lot more, especially if you're going to be going away for some period of time, because there's more area for watering. The downside is that the soil at 6, 8, 10 inches deep is much cooler than near the surface. And heat is what we're talking about, because what you want to do for your tomato plants is select an area, at least in Tahoe and Truckee, where you have some heat, so a south-facing or west-facing wall or fence, and some protection from wind if you're down in the Carson Valley area. So as Sue showed us, planting it near that rock wall, the wall will absorb heat and then re-radiate that heat and will help your tomatoes develop and ripen. So planting next to a wall or fence, south or west facing side, the heat that is absorbed by that structure will radiate out at night and keep your tomatoes nice and warm. For soil, we're looking at 6.2 to 6.8, which is perfect for Tahoe. That and Truckee, that's what we have typically, so it's great. As Sue demonstrated, you want to put some fertilizer at the time of planting or before you're planting. I'm recommending about 1 pound of a 10-10-10 slow release fertilizer for 100 square feet at the time or just before you plant. If you're planting in lower or sandy soils or planting in low organic matter soils, you may want to put some well-aged compost or well-aged composted manure to improve the moisture holding capacity. Tomatoes do not like soggy roots. So if your soil does not drain well, you may want to add some silica sand or perlite or vermiculite to your soil mix to loosen it up to allow better percolation of water. Again, for growing tomatoes in Tahoe, we are fighting the cool evening temperatures, and the cool evening temperatures affect the soil. So by planting either through perforated plastic, clear or red, will help you increase your soil temperatures as well as retain soil moisture. So you need actually less water for your plants. What happens is that this acts like a surface greenhouse. The sunlight goes through the plastic, and then the plastic re-radiates that down to the soil. So it'll raise your soil temperatures several degrees. Black plastic will heat up, but it does not transfer the heat to the soil nearly as well as red or clear plastic. If you are growing in containers, you may want to select dark colored containers like terracotta or black, and stay away from white containers or tan containers. The reason again is that these containers will absorb the heat, warm up the soil, and will help the roots stay warm, which will help the plants stay healthy and mature the fruit days or weeks earlier than otherwise would happen. Another trick that you can use is buying or placing these water system. This is a water wall. Over here is this water wall that you can buy, commercially available, to wrap around your plant to keep the stems and the lower leaves warm. You can also do that simply by taking large food storage bags, baggies, putting colored water in them so it heats up, and then placing them near the base of your plant. And then at the end of the season, just empty out the colored water around the plant. Oh, let's see, here we go. And then as the weather cools, you need to keep the plants warm. And here in Tahoe this week, we're going to have some freezing temperatures in the next few days. So if your tomatoes, or if you have tomatoes out already, you're going to have to protect them in the next couple of days. And one of them is with a frost blanket. It comes in different thicknesses, and you cover that. What I use in my yard is strictly a clear plastic bag that goes over my frame support, and I can use that to keep the temperatures around the tomato plant 2 or 3 degrees warmer than without it. And it's important to always stake your frost blanket or your covers so that you don't have to chase them around the neighborhood when the winds come up. This lower one here, this insulated row cover, is kind of interesting because it is a frost blanket, but on either side of the frost blanket it is these tubes of water that again warm up during the day and radiate heat at night to keep your plants nice and warm. Kind of expensive, but is a way to do it. And then there's guys like Lenny out there that have greenhouses dedicated to growing tomatoes with sound systems that plays classical music. So it's essential for tomatoes that you keep them off the ground, and that requires some type of support system. You can make your own support system out of twigs and vines, and the one that Sue demonstrated I thought was fascinating, because what she did was use an old sunflower stalk from last year, and she uses that as a support trellis for her indeterminate tomato plants. Kind of really innovative use of materials. You can pin or wire your tomato plants to a fence. You can use the cages that was also demonstrated, and you can buy online the very expensive trellises if that's the way you want to go. One of the things about trellising and training your tomato plants is making sure that you trim them and prune them so that you can maximize production. And today we're going to have Sue demonstrate a couple of that. So Sue, I hope you're still there, man, with that wind. Thanks a lot. We'll catch you in a few minutes.
Okay, sound is good?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, here
Hi.
we go.
It's me again, and I'm going to show you how to prune tomatoes. Okay, so here we have a determinate tomato plant. And as you can see, I hope you can see, I'm going to try to hold it still. As you can see, it's pretty much like one main stem, kind of like more like a bush. And this tomato is going to produce its tomatoes and then it dies. So it makes its tomatoes and dies. So it's determined to make its tomatoes and die. That's how I remember, because it's very confusing. The name indeterminate versus determinate, it's one of those things you'll trick yourself. So to prune this, it's kind of a one and done kind of deal. You just go ahead and take off everything up 6 to 8 inches, because this is where your dirt's going to be, and you kind of want that space there, like we talked about, and pests and all that bad stuff. This will keep them nice and clean. Plus, those only take away from the rest of the tomato plant. You know, tomatoes do prune them. I know that it's pretty, and you want to keep every leaf that you have, but just do it, and you'll thank me later. So this one's pretty much one and done, ready to plant. Determinate tomato plant. There you go. Okay, one main stem. And that's when you would use a cage for like a bush style tomato. Right here, I got my cage in and I got my stick in the dirt, my trellis, my sunflower stock, which is hopefully gonna work awesome. Okay, now we have an indeterminate tomato plant. And as you can see, this one looks a lot different. It looks like it has many, many shoots, which it does. So with this one, what you're gonna wanna do is same thing, the spacing 6 to 8 inches. So take off, start at the bottom, and you always remove anything dead or bad looking like that. Like anything like that at any time during the year, to just take it off. And this one, this sucker, that would have been, this guy would have created a whole nother tomato plant, or it will create a whole nother tomato plant. Therefore, this will start, it'll branch out to another arm. So you get rid of those because it's just a mess if you let them go. Going up. And see these, how they're 45-degree angles, like an armpit? I took off most of the suckers. Can you hand me another? I'll just show you on this one. Okay. Anyway, when you have an indeterminate tomato plant, they're gonna get, in the little armpit here, they're gonna get a little shoot that comes out. This one just doesn't have any yet. And this is an indeterminate tomato plant. So you want to take those off all the time. It'll come out at a 45, just like that. Take them off, leave the big ones, and go. An indeterminate tomato plant. And I have an example now of suckers. Thank you so much. All right, this is a really, really good example. This is another Roma, I do believe. And these are the suckers. Do you see? Hopefully you can see right here, these ones, and also this. And this one, and all this, all those 45s. Take them off. 45 degrees. Take them off. Take them off. Always take them off all the way up. And then see how there's, you want to choose about three main branches, or you're going to have a huge mess of a plant, because this one will just keep going and going. It's not determined when it's going to stop producing. So that's indeterminate. Hopefully you guys are catching that. This is very important. So yeah, this looks like it's going to grow. But these are just leaves. It looks like it's going to go 3 ways, maybe. It's kind of young to tell. But keep it to 3 main branches. You'll thank me later for that too. And you'll have really juicy, really good tomatoes. So I wish you guys all the best of luck. And thanks for watching.
Okay, thank you very much. So the takeaway from that for the indeterminate, well, I like the phrase "one and done." So that's great for the determinate varieties. And then for the indeterminate varieties, what you're going to end up with is 3 stems that are growing up through your trellis that will have tomatoes growing for the whole growing season. Very nicely done, Sue. Thank you very much. Let's go back to our tomato PowerPoint and see if we can get through this. There, I hope we're back on and everybody can hear me. So after you've trellised your tomatoes, trimmed them up, pruned them, you're going to start getting fruit. You want to pick the tomatoes when they're fully ripe if possible. As cooler weather in the Truckee, Tahoe, Carson Valley area takes hold, the fruit will not ripen consistently. And at that point, as it's partially ripe, you need to make a decision to pick it and then put it in a paper bag, or put it, if you put it in a paper bag, you can put a banana or apple or something to help ripen the fruit. You can also, partially ripened fruit can be ripened oftentimes just by placing it in a sunny location in the house, like a window. One of the methods that was recommended by Gary Romano, who grows tomatoes just north of Truckee on his farm, and wrote a book called July and Winter. The way he recommends it is to pull the whole plant out at the end of the season, cut off the roots, and then either hang the whole plant in a garage or on a table, or place it somewhere out of the way. And the reason for that is that once the plant has been severed from the roots, certain hormone-like compounds, chemical compounds, will tell the fruit to ripen because the plant is dying. And it's basically saying, you guys had better set seeds, because if not, then we're not going to make it into next year. So that was the idea behind that. We've tried that here locally, and it is an effective program for ripening end of season fruit. It's very effective.
I know that's true.
And then after the harvest, you want to remove and dispose all of the plants and plant materials, clean up your garden. The reason you want to do that is it limits the amount of diseases and insects and all that kind of stuff that affects you, which is our next slide. So when you're growing tomatoes here in Tahoe, you have certain pests, aphids, cutworms, beetles, hornworms, which seems to freak everybody out. Although the hornworm is a caterpillar that produces a very beautiful hawk moth, one of the few moths, few animals in the world that can actually hover in place while flying. It can, like a hummingbird. Very interesting moth. Anyway, a lot of these can be controlled with garden sanitation. That means you hand pick off the caterpillars. If you have aphids, you use a soap solution to spray it off. You can also use the Bacillus thuringiensis to control the moths, the cutworms, and the hornworms. The problem with using the Bacillus thuringiensis is that it does inhibit the development of all moths and butterflies. So if you have a butterfly that's just taking nectar from your tomato plant, it could be affected. Whiteflies are here in Tahoe. Seems every few years we have a whitefly problem, and aphids seem to be seasonal. And again, good inspection of your plants, and then using soap sprays and horticultural oils will take care of it. Birds, mice, squirrels are best controlled with some type of an exclusion system, either a netting or an enclosure of some kind. There are diseases that affect tomatoes, very similar to what affects potatoes. Early and late blights, soil nematodes, fusarium wilt, and viruses. And the best solution to controlling these diseases are, one, select resistant varieties, and the ones we selected for you this time all have some degree of resistance. And then to rotate your crops so that you don't get a buildup of nematodes or viruses in your soil. So a good crop after tomatoes or potatoes or eggplants or peppers would be like beans and peas that will provide some additional nitrogen into the soil. Diseases that you can control as a gardener are powdery mildew, fruit splitting, rot of the fruit, and then dampening off of the seedlings. These typically happen when you either have poor watering techniques, or where the watering is up and down. For fruit splitting, as an example, the fruit will size up but remain green. So if the moisture is consistent while it sizes up, gets to a certain size, and then suddenly there's more water available, the fruit will split as the water is absorbed. So by having consistent watering practices, you can prevent a lot of the fruit splitting. If you water late in the day, or if you have summer rains that occur and the leaves of the plant are wet for long periods of time, powdery mildew in tomatoes is common. And for dampening off, that's where your seedling at the stem base where it contacts the soil suddenly starts rotting. We've found that that is caused by two things. One is inconsistent watering, for the soil is excessively wet. And the other reason is that you have too much fertilizer in your soil for the seedlings, and it basically fries the seedling. So those are things to look for as you're growing your tomato plants. So now the history of the tomatoes, which I find fascinating. I mentioned that the Spanish found the tomatoes in Mexico when the conquistadors took over. They brought seeds to Europe around 1540s. Most of the documentation that has been reported indicate that tomatoes, the original tomatoes brought to Europe, were yellow in color, which is why they got the name Pomodoro or golden apple. They were originally not well received except in those territories controlled by Spain. The Spanish knew that it was a very good food source based on their interactions with the indigenous people in North America. And so in Spain-controlled territories, it became a popular food. In other areas, because of its relationship with belladonna, a poison, it was considered a poisonous plant or whatever. It was not received very well. And as I mentioned previously, for some reason in England, it was considered an aphrodisiac, and it got the name love apple. But by the 1800s, in Europe anyway, a lot of tomatoes were being consumed in salads and even as desserts. In the United States, the basic idea was that the tomatoes were poisonous. I mentioned the You Were There episode on TV. That was hosted, by the way, by Walter Cronkite. Can you imagine? So it was kind of a weird program where they had this period piece where the people were dressed up in, like Thomas Jefferson. In fact, I thought I was about wearing my wig, but I went with the sun hat. Anyway, so they would have this period piece where the people were dressed up and talk about a history, and then all of a sudden, out of the side would come a modern 20th century man with a microphone to interview the people about what was going on. It was kind of a strange program. But the episode involving Thomas Jefferson, he knew that the tomato was a very nutritious food. He had encountered it in Europe. He, in 1819, on his way to his summer residence, stopped in Lynchburg, Virginia, saw these very ripe, very beautiful tomatoes growing on a vine, took one, ate one. The people thought they were killing the president of the United States, and he lived and survived, and it was a whole big thing. And he explained that it was a nutritious food, and that the people who were growing it for ornamental purposes had quickly started eating it as well. The idea of the tomato, though, as a food kind of was slow to be accepted, but the first breakthrough came with the idea that tomatoes had a compound that would cure everything and was a common part of patent medicines. And the compound that they claimed was called tomatine. And as late as 1839 in Hartford, Connecticut, for example, 30% of the newspaper consisted of tomato advertisements looking for these tomatine compounds that would cure everything from gallbladder and incontinence and intestinal problems, which was a huge problem back in the day before modern sanitation. So anyway, that was it. But because it was considered a health aspect, people started eating them, incorporating them into their cuisine. The original recipes came from the southern colonies, the southern states, where they had contact with the Spanish territories. Anyway, because of fresh tomatoes grew, there was a need to be the first to come to market with your tomatoes. And just as today, tomatoes that are first in the market command the best prices. And so farmers in New England who started growing tomatoes recognized that if they could come up with a way to get it to market early, they got more tomatoes. And if they came late, there would be a glut. And oftentimes the value of the tomato was not worth harvesting. And so the tomatoes would rot in the field. So the farmers in New England started buying land in Maryland and Virginia, and the newfangled railroads that were in operation were able to ship the tomatoes grown in Virginia to New York, Philadelphia, and in St. Louis and Cincinnati. They were being brought up the Mississippi River in those newfangled side wheel steamships, and it was great. Those farmers that could not afford to buy land in the South and ship, they started growing tomatoes in hot houses and hand pollinating, or using cold frames to get early production. A cold frame is like a small greenhouse close to the ground. And then for me, interestingly, it was the use of hotbeds, which is a cold frame, which is close to the ground greenhouse. But instead of just soil, they would put layers of raw manure, then covering it with soil, and then planting your plants, and then putting the cold frame over top of that. And the rotting manure would heat the soil and heat it up so that the plants would grow very quickly. And then, of course, the term hotbed was taken to mean those things that were not good if you dug into them. So like it was a hotbed of secession, a hotbed of discontent, those kind of things. So taking the word for another use. They also looked at early ripening varieties that could be transported long distances. And this was really the blossoming in the first generation of determinate plants, determinate tomato plants. The tomato, because early season tomatoes had a premium value, the late season tomatoes weren't worth the effort to harvest them. That gave an opportunity for canners and bottlers to start looking at taking that surplus and making a business out of it. And one of the first to do that was Joseph Campbell, who started life out in providing Civil War rations. And then in 1869, he started a company to preserve and can these tomatoes. The tomato, I have to say, has kind of a mixed bag in these early days, because the tomato is acidic, and the common canning method they used was for soldering cans using a lead solder, so that the lead would leach in acidic situations. And so tomatoes were one of the last ones to be resolved in canning. They had to overcome the issue of lead poisoning in the cans because of the acidity. Anyway, the Campbell Company overcame that. The Campbell Company started specializing in tomato products. They changed their name in 1876 to Campbell's Preserve Company, and then it was the Campbell's condensed soup was introduced in 1897. They changed their name to Campbell Soups later on, and in 1931 they came up with the famous jingle for Campbell Soup. The other use of tomatoes, of course, is in ketchup, which also is a fascinating story. Ketchup, and different people have different claims on the origin of ketchup, but my sources indicated that it was an Asian invention that contained fermented fish, and it was used as a condiment. And a condiment here is defined as a spice or an addition to a food that did not require refrigeration. So ketchup was one, mustard was another, relishes and pickles were other condiments that did not require refrigeration because they had a preservative method used. In the case of early ketchup, it was oftentimes alcohol like brandy, and the first tomato-based ketchup in England around 1812 used brandy as the preservative. And then modern ketchup started appearing in the 1860s using vinegar and sugar as preservatives. And then the Heinz ketchup was in a advertising competition with Hazard tomato ketchup. And the Heinz won out. Hazard went bankrupt because Heinz advertising claimed that Hazard ketchup was a hazard because of impurities. Modern advertising. To wrap this up in the United States, as these companies became national rather than just regional companies, they wanted consistency in product, consistency in taste, year to year, bottle to bottle. And so they started paying farmers to grow specific varieties so that their ketchup products or their tomato products were similar year to year and from region to region. And as a consequence, there was a big push by commercial corporations to develop varieties that had certain characteristics, including ability to be stored, processed, and ripened very quickly to minimize costs. And so in the early 20th century, these working with a number of universities, they came up with these determinate varieties. And Flavor Saver was the ultimate example of that, where they started to introduce genes into the tomato biome or genetics to control how the plant ripened, tasted, and could be stored. When we're talking about nutrition, which a couple years ago everybody wanted me to include, I decided to look at red tomatoes versus yellow tomatoes and see if there's a big difference. And in terms of calories and proteins and fiber, there's not a lot of big difference. But when you get down to vitamin A, for example, you don't get any vitamin A in a yellow tomato. It's all in the red tomato. And when you talk about foliates, it's twice as high in yellow tomatoes as in red tomatoes. And vitamin D, it's twice as high as in yellow tomatoes as red tomatoes. So there is a significant difference in the nutritional value between yellow and red tomatoes. Yeah, I know, kind of weird. And we talked about in the 1820s and 1830s this tomotine, but believe it or not, there is a compound in tomatoes called lycopene, which in the late 20th century has been claimed to reduce the risk of heart disease and certain cancers, although the last review that I did, 2010, it was really insufficient to claim that benefit, but what goes around comes around, I guess. One of the last thing about the horticultural aspects of growing tomatoes is Many people like to take the seeds, preserve the seeds, and then seed saving is a very popular thing. And there's really two ways of doing it as a home gardener. One is to take the ripe tomato, squeeze the seeds and juice out, put it in a container, label it, of course, so you know which variety you're dealing with, and then put the container with the juice and everything in a dark location. It will start going rancid. There'll be flies and odors, but allow it to sit until the mold forms, 3 or 4 days. You may need to add water so it doesn't become dried out and pasty. And then decant off the liquids. Any seeds that sink in this solution will be ripe and ready to go. Any that float are not viable, so decant those off, save the seeds that sink. If you're selling or distributing them, it's highly recommended that you soak them in a bleach solution to kill any fungus or bacteria. And then place the seeds on a dry surface to dry, or a clean dry surface to dry out. Don't use a paper towel or cloth because the seeds will stick. And then after they dry for 5 or 6 days, you can label them, put them in a Ziploc bag, and they're ready to go for next year. Do not freeze tomato seeds. If you guys remember last week when you talked about strawberry seeds, we needed to freeze those to get them to germinate. Tomato seeds are just the opposite. Do not freeze the seeds. I wanted to say, okay, that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is to take a tomato, seeds and all, eat the tomato, seeds and all, let it go through your digestive system, come out the other side, pick out the seeds, and that's the same thing as what we've talked about. So basically, the tomato seeds are designed in nature to go through a digestive process, and then they will be viable. Pick your way the way you want to do it. One of the nice things about tomatoes is that they are everywhere, with festivals and parties to celebrate growing tomatoes. And even in 2021, with our COVID ending restrictions, we have a number of festivals going on. Los Banos here in California in September, the French Market Creole Tomato Fest in New Orleans in July, and this coming weekend in Arkansas, in Warren County, in Bradley County. It's the Bradley County Pink Tomato Festival. In Bradley County, they grow a specific type of pink fleshed tomato. And you can sign up this weekend to compete in the pre-teen pink tomato pageant or Miss Pink Tomato. Also, they have a number of things this weekend in Arkansas. In Italy, everybody wants to know, why is Italy famous for their tomatoes? It was introduced in the 1540s. The famous Cosimo de' Medici was the first Italian known to grow tomatoes. The tomato, when it was ripe, was brought to him while he was in Pisa from his estates, and his response was, yeah, okay. But by the 1500s, middle 1500s, the Renaissance wars are all over, and the area of Spain south of Naples was controlled by Spain. Because of that, many of the Spanish recipes, including those involving tomatoes, were brought to that portion of Italy, incorporated into Italian dishes. And as a consequence, that Southern Italian tomato sauce became a staple commodity by the 1800s, and is why Italy exports more processed tomatoes than any other country in the world. So the last thing on tomatoes before we get to the distribution, you are an optimist if you are a gardener here in Tahoe and Truckee, and you're a masochist if you try to grow tomatoes in Tahoe and Truckee, and you are considered a sadist if you successfully grow your tomatoes in Tahoe and then remind all your neighbors how well you did. Okay, so that's just about it. This Saturday, we're going to be distributing our tomatoes. In Truckee, it's at the demonstration garden there at the regional park. Tahoe City, it's at the UC Field Station. And in South Lake Tahoe, it's in the parking lot of Big Five or the Verde Mexican Rotisserie. The people at Big Five and the Mexican Rotisserie do not know what we're doing. The owners and the managers do. So don't phone them to find out whether or not we're going to be there. We will be there even if it's raining or snowing or windy. And if there's questions, that's my email address. And again, you can check with the folks at Slow Foods Lake Tahoe. It will be posted on the YouTube channel. I think it's going to be on Master Gardeners and Turk and Slow Foods in the next couple of days. The next couple of slides, here we go, are our tomato worksheets, the cheat sheets, if you want to go through that later on once it's posted. And I know I went through a lot of information very quickly, and thank you, Sue, again, and Annie for doing the live demonstration. But really, that's it, and I hope that the Zoom meeting didn't explode like it's done in the past, and I think I'm done, so I'm going to stop sharing.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dave. We can move to our question and answer session. We've had just a couple questions come in. So if anyone has any last minute burning questions for Dave, remember to put those in the chat, which you can access at the bottom. One of our participants, Beth, actually shared and said that their dogs eat tomatoes and they plant them in our yard with the appropriate fertilizer, meaning that they eat them and digest them like Dave suggested. And so maybe Beth has fun tomato plants popping up all over thanks to her dogs. Those cheat sheets that Dave mentioned will be available at pickup with all of the starter plants. If you do not, if you have not already purchased starter plants and are still interested in getting starter plants, I'm going to put the link in the chat right now where anyone who has not registered, or if you want to double register and get twice as many tomato plants for starts, I just put the link in the chat where you can access and still register for those tomato plants. But Dave, questions for you, and maybe this is also a question for Sue if she's still around, but I imagine Dave can tackle it, was did you add water to the hole prior to planting your tomatoes?
The soil should be damp already when you plant it. And then after you plant the tomato, you should water it in to make sure you have good soil root contact.
Awesome. Next question. When you trench plant, another stem may emerge from the buried stem. Should you treat this as a separate plant or view it as an unwanted sucker to be pruned?
Unwanted sucker to be pruned.
That's it? It's an unwanted sucker? Prune it?
Cut it and be done with it.
Your inflection was kind of inquisitive, as if you were unsure. So the next question that I haven't typed in because my second computer is freaking out, but I can read it to you. Someone is asking, I'm hoping to do a square foot garden this year. How many tomatoes per square foot?
1 tomato per square foot. But keep in mind, if it's a heirloom tomato, it may be 8 foot tall. Or a bush tomato may be 2 foot tall, but 2 foot wide when it's grown out. But 1 per square foot in a square foot gardening setup would be great.
All right. And then the next question, should we pinch off flowers on seedlings before we plant them? That's one, there were multiple questions. So we'll start there. Should we pinch off flowers on seedlings before we plant them?
As Sue effectively demonstrated, pinching off the flowers at the time you transplant it is pretty essential. However, here in Tahoe, anytime you pinch off any flower, you run the risk of delaying ripening. So pinch off those few first flowers is what Sue's recommending. Just be aware that if we have a very early frost, you won't have quite as many tomatoes possibly, but it's pinch them off.
And why is that? Why do we remove the flowers?
When you transplant the plant, it will be stressed. And what you want to do is force the plant to develop a more extensive root system now that it has more space, and take the energy from photosynthesis to build leaves, stems, and structure, so you will have a more robust plant when you get your next flush of flowers. If you don't, then you'll get those first fruit, but they may not be full sized, and because the plant is somewhat stressed, you won't get the development of additional flowers later on.
Great. And then another question, is the cheat sheet available online? The cheat sheet will be sent out in the follow-up email. I believe. I will double check if not. And if that is not the case, we will make them available online. There was a second part to the earlier question. What should we expect from different size container? Is bigger always better in terms of container size for our tomato plants, not tomato?
Great question. Before I answer though, going back, we should have the cheat sheets available when you pick up your plants as well. So when you get your plants, you should get a cheat sheet, although that doesn't help people who are just doing the workshop. So what you need is at least maybe 2 cubic feet of soil for a tomato plant, an indeterminate plant, maybe a cubic foot and a half for a determinate tomato plant. So if you have a larger container, that's fine, but really it's not necessary. The other thing about tomatoes, if they get too much fertilizer, if they're living too high on the hog, what will happen is you'll have this beautiful looking tomato plant, but you'll have few fruit that do not ripen quickly. They'll just stay green. And so what you want to do in those cases is stress the plant out by taking off some leaves, reducing watering, to stress the plant so that they can ripen the fruit. If you have a lot of soil, like having a large container, then that could contribute to having a very nice, lazy plant that looks great, but is not producing tomatoes. And that's very similar to what you find with potatoes as well, a similar closely related plant. In fact, you can actually graft a tomato plant onto a potato rootstock, and you can get both potatoes and tomatoes. But if you do it wrong, you won't get any tomatoes or potatoes. So there you go.
Is there a rule of thumb on watering your tomato plants?
No, just consistent watering for the soil is moist. If you're trench planting, especially, you do not want the soil to dry out below an inch or inch and a half below the soil surface. If you're deep planting, you can let the top 1 inch, 1.5 inch, 2 inches even dry out, and it won't affect it. But what you don't want to do is dry it out to the point where the plant looks wilted and then water it a whole lot so that it's really robust. And that variation is what causes fruit splitting and inconsistent setting of fruit. The other thing about inconsistent setting of fruit would be if you lack pollinators in your area. The fruit, the flowers will just dry up and drop off because lack of pollination, which is another thing that we've experienced in certain areas here in Tahoe and Truckee.
Are there different fertilizers for foliage and ripening fruit times?
We've suggested that you use a well-balanced, like a 10-10-10 or something equivalent in organic fertilizers. What you don't want is a high nitrogen fertilizer that has little or no potassium or phosphorus. And the high nitrogen fertilizers, an example would be ammonium sulfate, 21% nitrogen, 0 potassium, 0 phosphorus. That will have tremendous growth of vegetative aspects, but will do nothing for either flower formation or plant or fruit setting.
Alrighty, those are all the questions that I have for you that have come in right now, Dave. Are there any, well, we'll give everyone a last minute in case they have any other burning questions come through. Oh, another one came through. Is Miracle Grow a good fertilizer?
Yeah, it's funny, Miracle Grow, we don't recommend any specific fertilizer or group of fertilizers, but Miracle Grow is a very good balanced, slower release fertilizer that you can add at the time of planting or side dress after you've planted it, or added it to the plant within the first 2 weeks or so of transplanting your tomato. After that, you have to add fertilizers, Miracle Grow being a good one to use, as the plant either starts to yellow or stops setting fruit, or then you can adjust your fertilizers. But it's really hard to do without also doing soil testing to see what's really in the soil, because you just don't want to keep adding fertilizers without knowing why. So,
Beginning.
Alrighty. Dave, do you have any last minute thoughts to share on success with tomatoes before we wrap up?
good luck.
You bring them inside if they're yellow. If you have a whole bunch of them, then they're green.
Okay, are we done?
There was one other question that came in. We have the voice of our potato expert, Melissa, coming through in the background as well. Last question, any experience with using any of the full circle amendments?
No, I'm very hesitant to recommend or suggest any specific type of commercially available product. And in all honesty, I'm not real familiar with the full circle product, except as a potting soil mixture when I'm preparing my raised beds. So not familiar with it except in preparing the raised beds, and it was very effective in that application.
Awesome. All right, well, I'm going to share my screen one last time so that we can just review what Dave has already shared with you all regarding pickup on
Online, you bring them inside.
this weekend. So I have a, whoops, too far. So if you want to rewatch any of our previous workshops, they are available on the Slow Food Lake Tahoe website at this link here. And we have one remaining workshop next Tuesday at 5 p.m. on herbs. As I said, that presentation will be with Heather Adams, who is our Organic Gardening 101 presenter. And then if you have additional questions for Dave through the growing season, I'm sure he will be happy to answer any questions, whether it be on tomatoes, strawberries, or anything general gardening. Like I said, he has a lot of experience growing in this area. So that's David M. Long at earthlink.net. And then finally, this Saturday at between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m., we have our pickup for tomato plants. And that is at those 3 locations that Dave mentioned in South Lake Tahoe, at the Truckee Food Bank Garden, and at the Tahoe City Demonstration Garden, which is the same location as the, what do we call it? Tahoe City Field Station, my place of work. So I'm going to put the link in the chat one more time for everyone. If you are still interested in ordering or donating to receive starter plants, and you can pick those up this Saturday morning and indicate where you would like to pick those up. But as always, thank you for joining us this evening. And we look forward to seeing you all next week for our herbs presentation.
Now, how can we watch it?
Okay.
Let's put it on the YouTube.